Have you ever, stopped to consider that the way you view an entire continent or a foreign culture, or, even just the person sitting across from you on the train might just be a reflection of your own culture's hidden operating system?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is a profoundly uncomfortable question when you really sit with it, because we tend to believe that our perception of the world is objective.
Right, like a camera taking a perfectly clear photograph.
Exactly, like a camera. But the reality is far closer to uh, a painter painting a portrait. I mean, every single brushstroke is influenced by that painter's training, their biases, the era they happen to live in.
Well, today we're going to look at the painter. We're doing a deep dive into a text that honestly fundamentally changed how I understand the construction of knowledge itself. It's called The Invention of Africa by V.Y. Mudimbe.
It is such an incredible piece of work.
It really is. And our mission today for you, the listener, is to figure out how Africa, as a unified concept, as an idea in the global imagination, was essentially engineered. We're going to explore how Western discourse through art, anthropology, religion, economics didn't just discover a continent.
No, not at all.
Right. They actually constructed a very specific, highly curated version of it.
Yeah, and Mudimbe's work is really a cornerstone of modern thought for exactly that reason. But to navigate it properly, we really have to start with his subtitle, which is Gnosis, Philosophy, and the Order of Knowledge.
Okay, let's unpack this right out of the gate. The word gnosis. Why use that instead of philosophy? Because I feel like if we are talking about deep, structured African thought, why not just call it philosophy and put it on the exact same shelf as, I don't know, Plato and Kant?
Well, because placing it on that specific shelf subjects it to the rules of a game it never actually agreed to play.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean by that?
So when we use the word philosophy in a strict academic setting, we are referencing a highly specific, very linear European tradition. So,
Like ancient Greece.
all right, we're talking about a framework that descends directly from the Greeks, and it is heavily, heavily reliant on written texts. It demands formal logic and attracts a very particular lineage of thinkers. Aristotle, Descartes, Hegel.
The classic Western canon.
Exactly. And Mudimbe argues that if you go looking for philosophy in Africa, using strictly those European criteria if you're just looking for written treatises or formal academic schools, you will inevitably conclude that it doesn't exist.
Because you're looking for an apple in an orange grove.
Yes. You will miss the forest entirely because you are hyper-focused on finding a very specific type of European tree.
So using the word philosophy is almost a trap. You are immediately judging a totally different culture system of knowledge by a hyper-localized European brand of thinking.
Exactly. And that is exactly why he turns to the word gnosis. Etymologically, it comes from ancient Greek, and it simply means to know or seeking to know.
It's a lot broader.
It is a much broader, far more encompassing term. So African gnosis refers to structured, common, and conventional knowledge, inquiry, and investigation.
But it's not necessarily bound in a textbook.
No, it has its own strict procedures for transmission, but they are often oral. They are embedded in ritual and linguistics and social structures. So by using gnosis, Mudimbe deliberately steps outside that Western academic enclosure. He basically demands that we look at African systems of thought on their own inherent terms.
I really appreciate that framing. It essentially says, we aren't going to judge the depth of your poetry by the rigid rules of our calculus.
That's a great way to put it.
But, this theoretical framing didn't just happen in the clouds, right? It happened alongside a brutally physical reality. So let's ground this for a second. Let's talk about the scramble for Africa.
Right, the late 19th to mid-20th century, the physical subjugation of the entire continent.
Yeah. And when I think of colonialism, I usually just picture the military conquest, gunboats, soldiers, guys in pith helmets drawing arbitrary borders on a map.
Sure, the standard historical image.
Right. But the source material digs into the root of the word itself. And this blew my mind. The word colonialism comes from the Latin colere, which actually means to cultivate or to design.
Yes, it does.
Wait, cultivate sounds so benign, almost positive, like a friendly gardener.
Yeah.
How on earth does that translate into violently forcing organization onto an entire continent?
Well, it is the ultimate blindingly arrogant assumption of the gardener looking at a wild, ancient forest. To the Western mind, that word colere implied that non-European spaces were just unorganized. They were chaotic, or totally barren.
So they needed fixing.
Right. To colonize was to cultivate them into a recognizable European order. And Budime outlines how this colonizing structure wasn't just a simple military land grab. It actually operated on 3 highly coordinated levels.
Okay, let's break those 3 levels down. What is the actual mechanism here?
The first, you have the domination of physical space. This is the military aspect you mentioned earlier.
Right.
The drawing of borders, acquiring the land, physically displacing indigenous people.
The brute force part.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But second, and honestly far more insidious, is the reformation of the natives' minds. This is the psychological cultivation.
How exactly do they do that? I mean, practically speaking.
Through the aggressive imposition of new social norms, they set up Western educational systems that teach European history instead of local history.
Oh, wow. So you learn about French kings instead of your own ancestors.
Precisely. And they introduce Western religion, which is a massive tool we will discuss deeply a bit later. But the ultimate goal of all of this is domestication.
Domestication, that's a heavy word. And the third level?
The third level is the integration of local economies into a Western capitalist perspective.
Meaning what, exactly?
It means totally upending how people live. Subsistence farming, where people grow what they need to eat, is replaced by cash crops for European export. Local, functional trade networks are dismantled and completely rerouted to serve the European metropole.
So it's this complementary trinity: physical, psychological, and economic control. But reading through the text, there's a massive debate about the underlying why of this structure, specifically the economic part.
Yes, the debate over the core motivation.
Right. Was this a calculated master plan by European elites, or was it just like a chaotic, opportunistic frenzy?
It is actually one of the most significant debates in historical sociology. Mudimbe presents 2 drastically opposed viewpoints here. On one side, we have the perspective championed by the economist Joseph Schumpeter and the historian J.A. Hobson.
Okay, what was their take?
Schumpeter viewed imperialism as this atavistic, totally irrational, objectless impulse.
Objectless, meaning they didn't really have a clear goal in mind.
Precisely. Schumpeter actually argued that capitalism, in its purest theoretical form, is rational and inherently anti-imperialist.
Really? That seems counterintuitive today.
Well, he believed that the scramble for Africa was driven by leftover pre-capitalist warrior instincts that were still lingering within European aristocracies. He saw it as a non-rational inclination toward forcible expansion and war, with 0 definite utilitarian limits.
So Schumpeter is essentially saying the scramble for Africa was like a massive bar fight that just got horribly globally out of hand, just a fever of nationalistic ego.
That is a very fair summation of his view. But then, on the other hand, we have the opposing side, which is the Marxist and neo-Marxist interpretation.
Right, the other end of the spectrum.
Exactly. This is argued by thinkers like Vladimir Lenin, Samir Amin, and Immanuel Wallerstein. And they completely, utterly reject the irrational impulse theory. To them, colonialism was cold, calculated, and perfectly rational within the framework of capitalism.
Oh, so this is the hostile corporate buyout theory.
Yes. Wallerstein argues that colonialism was the inevitable culmination of capitalism. It was explicitly designed to extract surplus value and seamlessly integrate non-Western territories into a global capitalist world system.
But integrating them at the bottom.
Exactly, specifically as the marginalized periphery. In this view, the so-called underdevelopment of Africa wasn't some natural primitive state or a failure to catch up. It was a deliberate, engineered structural condition created to ensure the continuous development and wealth of Europe.
I gotta say, I really struggle to entirely buy Schumpeter's view that it was just an irrational accident. I mean, when you look at the infrastructure they built, like railways designed purely to take minerals from the deep interior straight to the coastal ports, completely bypassing all the local villages, that is deliberate economic engineering.
It certainly looks highly organized.
Yeah, but regardless of whether it was a mad frenzy or a calculated corporate raid, the result on the ground was catastrophic for the people living there. And that brings us to a concept Mudimbe details that I just found incredibly tragic: the idea of marginality.
Yes, marginality is perhaps the most painful, enduring legacy of that colonizing structure.
Because the colonizers set up this incredibly rigid, dichotomizing system, right? Everything was totally binary. You were either traditional or you were modern.
Or written.
Exactly. You had a backward subsistence economy or an advanced, highly productive European economy. There was no middle ground. And the implicit demand was that African societies were supposed to just abandon their entire past and leap instantly into European modernity.
But sociologically speaking, that is an impossible leap. I mean, you do not just erase centuries of deeply rooted tradition, complex kinship structures, and agricultural rhythms and magically replace them with the Industrial Revolution overnight.
It just doesn't work that way.
It doesn't. What actually happens is not a clean leap, but a devastating crash into a diffused, agonizing intermediate space. And that specific space is marginality.
The sources provide such concrete, heartbreaking examples of what this looks like in practice. Because it's not just some abstract theoretical concept. We are talking about severe demographic imbalances.
Oh, absolutely.
You have young men being physically pulled from their villages to go work in European mines or cities, which leaves the rural agriculture back home to completely collapse.
Exactly. And you see the rapid breakdown of classic extended family structures. Traditionally, the extended family provided a highly comprehensive social safety net, right?
Yeah, for childcare, elder care, economic support during bad harvests.
All of it. Yeah. But the Western model forces a nuclear family structure, or worse, completely fragmented families due to that migrant labor you mentioned. So the old safety net is destroyed. But here is the crux of the tragedy. The new Western safety net, things like pensions, state welfare, institutional health care, that isn't provided to the colonized people.
So they are left completely exposed.
Completely naked to the elements, economically speaking.
Right.
You have wildly high birth rates clashing with disrupted agricultural practices, which leads straight to poverty and massive famine.
And the cities just get overwhelmed.
Yes. You see the rise of these massive, sprawling shanty towns right on the edges of the shiny new European-style cities. And you also see it manifest spiritually with the explosion of syncretic churches.
What does syncretic mean in this context?
It means religious movements that desperately try to blend the fractured pieces of shattered traditional beliefs with the newly imposed Christian theology. Marginality is just this jarring, incredibly dissonant space between a mythical, irrecoverable past and the totally false illusion of development that was promised by the colonizer.
I was trying to visualize this whole mechanism, and I kept thinking of it like a really poorly executed corporate merger.
Okay, tell me about that.
So, say a massive tech conglomerate acquires a smaller, older company. The acquiring company just aggressively forces its brand new cloud-based software onto the acquired company's old legacy hardware.
Without upgrading the hardware.
Exactly. They don't take the time to upgrade the hardware or even try to understand its unique architecture. They just jam the new code in and demand that it runs perfectly. And the result isn't a sleek, efficient new company. It's a total disaster.
Because the systems reject each other.
Right. The legacy programs won't run anymore because they've been overridden, but the old hardware can't process the new software either, so the system just constantly glitches, it freezes, and eventually it crashes. It's just trapped in this agonizing digital purgatory.
That is an exceptionally good analogy because it really highlights the fundamental incompatibility and honestly the violence of that imposition. The sociologist P. Bigo is actually quoted in the text explaining this exact tension.
What does he say?
He notes that the models of the dominant nations impose themselves, and tragically, they are often sought after by the dominated out of sheer survival necessity. But they become deeply alienating factors. He says the marginal space is filled with vestiges of the past that survive almost like ghosts, hiding within the newly imposed structures.
That is haunting. But let me ask you this, and this is pushing back on the Marxist calculation theory a bit. Do you think the colonizers actually wanted this marginality? Because a glitching, failing system isn't highly productive. Was this agonizing middle ground the explicit goal, or was it just a terrible byproduct of their sheer arrogance?
It is a vital, really difficult question. And based on the historical evidence Mudebe synthesizes, it is highly likely that the profound social agony of marginality was initially an accidental byproduct.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The colonizers suffered from supreme epistemological arrogance. They genuinely believed their software was universally perfect. They honestly did not foresee the catastrophic glitching because they fundamentally didn't believe the indigenous hardware had any inherent complexity or value worth studying in the first place.
They just thought it was a blank slate.
Yes. They thought they were building on empty ground. However, once that marginal space was created, once the society was fundamentally destabilized, deeply impoverished, and entirely dependent, it absolutely served the ongoing power dynamics of the colonizers.
I see. So it became useful.
Very useful. A population caught in marginality, literally just struggling for basic daily survival, is infinitely easier to control and exploit than a cohesive, healthy, traditional society.
So the chaos becomes a tool of control, even if they didn't explicitly draw it up that way in a boardroom. But you can't just subjugate a continent, shatter its social structures, and exploit its resources without a massive cultural narrative to justify it to yourselves.
No, you need a story to sleep at night.
Exactly. To understand how Europe physically reshaped Africa, we have to look at how they first painted and classified it in their own minds. Which brings us to the visual and artistic construction of the other.
And this is where Mudimbe takes us way back to the roots of Western visual classification. He points to the year 1508.
1508, so we are going way back.
Way back, to a truly fascinating painting by a German artist named Hans Berkmer. The painting is called Exotic Tribe.
This specific example absolutely floored me when I read it. So Berkmer was a highly respected master of the Augsburg school, right? And he gets commissioned to illustrate a book by a traveler named Balthasar Springer.
That's right.
And Springer had supposedly journeyed overseas and seen these exotic African people. So what does Berkmer actually paint?
Well, Berkmer was faced with a massive dilemma. He had, in all likelihood, never seen an African person in his entire life.
Right.
He was working entirely from Springer's written travel diary and perhaps, a few rudimentary crude sketches. So to represent an African, Berkmer just used a white European model.
Wait, really?
Yes. He painted bodies that conformed absolutely perfectly to the classical Italian Renaissance ideal. He used contrapposto.
Oh, the posture thing.
Yeah, that beautifully balanced asymmetrical posture where the subject's weight rests heavily on one leg. It's an absolute hallmark of classical European sculpture.
Like Michelangelo's David.
Exactly like
Yeah.
David. So he paints these classically proportioned, idealized European bodies, and then he simply paints the skin black.
He literally just painted European bodies black.
Yes. And to signify their otherness, he layered on these totally superficial decorative markers of what a 16th century European guy imagined savagery to be. He added nakedness, really curly hair, exotic bracelets, strings of pearls, and primitive weapons.
So he paints a Greek god, colors him black, and hands him a spear. That is wild to me. But wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Isn't it a bit unfair to judge a 16th century painter by our modern 21st century standards of cultural representation? I mean, the guy had no reference material. He was just doing his best with the tools he knew.
Oh, that is a very fair point. And Mudimbe isn't necessarily judging Berkmer morally for this. He is using Berkmer as a perfect lens to reveal the underlying epistemology of the time.
Okay, epistemology, meaning how they understood knowledge.
Right. Michel Foucault actually refers to the 16th century Western mind as operating on the epistemology of similitude.
Stop right there. What does the epistemology of similitude actually mean in plain English?
It means that the 16th century Western mind processed the entire world strictly by looking for resemblances. The absolute baseline for reality was themselves.
Okay.
The prevailing theological and scientific thought of the day, which was based strictly on biblical origins, was that all human beings shared the exact same origin. They were all descendants of Adam and Eve. Therefore, fundamentally, everyone had to be the same, with a capital S.
Okay, so they quite literally couldn't fathom a genuinely different type of human.
Right. So when an artist is forced to represent the other, they simply cannot create something entirely alien. Their brain won't let them.
Right.
They start with the same, the normative, ideal European body, and then they just apply accidental, highly superficial differences to create a sense of cultural distance.
Wow.
The epistemology of similitude forces the exotic to be integrated and completely domesticated into a familiar framework. So the African becomes merely a distorted mirror reflection of the European. The true, complex, physical, and cultural reality of the actual African subject is just completely erased.
That makes perfect sense. It's a worldview where you are the absolute, unquestionable center of the universe, and everything else is just a weird variation of you.
Exactly.
But the sources note that this similitude mindset doesn't last forever. Things shift significantly by the 18th century, especially as the transatlantic slave trade tragically explodes and global contact increases.
Yes. By the 18th century, the entire epistemological foundation shifts. The West moves away from simply looking for vague resemblances and suddenly becomes utterly obsessed with taxonomies, tables, and rigid scientific classifications of species and human varieties.
This is the era of Carl Linnaeus, right? Categorizing the whole natural world.
Exactly, the era of Linnaeus.
And this intense classification obsession bled directly into how they handled African cultural objects, because you had sailors and merchants returning to Europe with objects they called fetishes like masks, carvings, ceremonial items.
Right. And initially, these items were simply tossed into curio cabinets.
Cabinets of curiosities.
Yes, right alongside, Indian tomahawks, Siamese drums, and weird rocks. They were just bizarre, unclassified oddities from the scary edges of the map. But as time went on, and that classifying impulse strengthened, these objects underwent a profound, really damaging transformation. The sociologist Jean Baudrillard describes this as a process of aesthetization.
What does that process actually mean for the object itself?
It means these deeply spiritual, highly contextual ceremonial objects were violently stripped of their original low meaning, and they were reclassified by Westerners as primitive art.
Oh, so they forced them into an art category.
Yes, they were judged by a purely Western aesthetic grid that basically equated these forms with the early infantile stages of human evolution. They were placed in glass cases in museums, not as testaments to a complex living culture, but as dead artifacts of a frozen, backward past.
And this dynamic didn't just stay trapped in the 18th century. It actually created a bizarre, ongoing economic loop that exists right now today. The text cites Benetta Jules Rosette's study on contemporary African tourist art, which I found totally fascinating.
Oh, the tourist art dynamic is incredibly revealing.
Because this is art produced locally in Africa today, specifically to be sold to Western tourists or exported to Western boutiques.
Right. And Jules Rosette highlights an intense, almost tragic tension here between authentic folk culture and the rigid demands of the international market. African artists quickly realized that Western buyers don't actually want art that reflects modern, complex African reality.
They don't want a painting of a modern city in Kenya.
No. The international market depends entirely on the Western demand for the exotic, for the primitive.
So the artists end up having to mass produce what Westerners assume is authentic African art.
Exactly. The economic exchange entirely dictates the symbolic exchange. The African artist is literally forced to become complicit in their own stereotyping just in order to survive economically. They carve the idealized primitive masks and wooden figures that perfectly match the Western hallucination of traditional Africa.
They're essentially trapped in an artistic feedback loop, producing souvenirs of a European fantasy. It's deeply, deeply cynical.
It is.
But this core assumption that the West holds the absolute, unassailable baseline for all knowledge doesn't just stop at art or little wooden souvenirs. It bleeds directly and aggressively into hard science. And we really have to talk about Carl Sagan and the Dogon people, because this story is just staggering.
What's fascinating here is that it is perhaps the most revealing illustration of epistemological ethnocentrism in the entire text. It perfectly demonstrates how a brilliant, celebrated scientific mind can be entirely, hopelessly blinded by his own cultural bias.
Okay, so let's set the stage for you listening. The Dogon people live in Mali, and in the 1930s and 40s, two French anthropologists, Marcel Griol and Germaine Dieterlen, spent years living with the Dogon and meticulously documenting their incredibly complex belief systems.
Yes.
And they discovered that the Dogon possess wildly advanced astronomical knowledge. They knew the planets revolved around the sun, which is impressive enough, but the real shocker was their knowledge of the star system Sirius.
Right, the dog star. The Dogon claimed that the bright star Sirius, which is easily visible in the night sky to anyone, had a dark, completely invisible companion star. They call this companion star Potulo.
Okay.
They knew it had an elliptical orbit around Sirius that took roughly 50 years to complete. And most astonishingly of all, they claimed this invisible star was incredibly small, but made of a phenomenally heavy, dense material they called sagala, which they said was a metal that doesn't exist on Earth.
And here is the absolute kicker for the listener. Everything the Dogon claimed is exactly what modern astrophysics later confirmed. Sirius does have a companion star. It's called Sirius B.
Yes?
It is a white dwarf. It is completely invisible to the naked eye. It has an elliptical orbit of exactly 50.1 years. And because it's a white dwarf, it is made of relativistically degenerate matter, meaning it is incredibly dense and heavy, like a teaspoon of it would weigh tons.
This presents a massive, almost existential problem for Western science. Because how could a supposedly primitive people in Mali possess precise knowledge of an invisible celestial body and its complex orbital mechanics without ever having telescopes?
Enter Carl Sagan, one of the most famous, beloved astronomers of the 20th century. He looks at this data, and instead of marveling at it or trying to understand it, he immediately tries to debunk it. What was his theory?
Well, Sagan simply could not accept that the Dogon possessed this knowledge independently. It fundamentally violated his entire evolutionary worldview. So he theorized a remarkably convoluted explanation. He suggested that sometime in the 1920s, a wandering, scientifically literate European, a Gallic visitor, he called him, perhaps an explorer or a missionary or an administrator, must have visited the Dogon.
A completely hypothetical, entirely unnamed French guy.
Yes. Séguin just assumed this wandering Frenchman must have read recent European astronomical theories about white dwarfs in some journal. He then somehow sat around a campfire with the high priests of the Dogon, traded his advanced European science for their local myths, and the Dogon simply absorbed the Frenchman's science, dressed it up in their own religious terminology, and then pretended it was an ancient tradition.
I honestly cannot get over the sheer blinding arrogance of that. He just invents a wandering French astrophysics enthusiast out of thin air to protect his own worldview.
It is quite a leap.
Let's unpack the timeline, because Mudimbe absolutely dismantles Séguin here.
Mudimbe points out the glaring, fatal flaws in Séguin's timeline. The Dogon's knowledge of this 50-year orbit wasn't just some casual campfire story they told to visitors. It was deeply structurally embedded in their most sacred, complex ritual, the Sigu ceremony.
And how often does that ceremony happen?
The Sigu is only celebrated every 60 years, and the cycles of this ritual are physically documented by the carving of specific, highly sacred masks, which are then kept in hidden sanctuaries. Anthropologists and historians have traced these masks and the rituals back through time. The Dogon actively incorporated the exact symbolism of this companion star into their Sigu rituals in 1907 and 1847, and even as far back as 1787.
Wait, 1787? That completely destroys Séguin's whole argument.
Completely. Western science didn't even suspect the existence of Sirius B until Friedrich Bessel observed its sinusoidal motion, the literal wobble it causes in the main star, in 1844.
So they couldn't even see it then?
No, it wasn't actually seen through a telescope until 1862. Furthermore, the complex Western hypothesis of relativistically degenerate matter, the extreme density the Dogon perfectly described, wasn't even proposed by European astronomers until the late 1920s and 30s.
So the Dogon were celebrating the exact orbital mechanics of an invisible white dwarf star decades, if not literally centuries, before European scientists even knew what a white dwarf was. Séguin's hypothetical French visitor wouldn't just need a telescope, he would have needed a time machine.
Precisely. Séguin's hypothesis, despite being proposed in the late 20th century, belongs entirely to the 19th century epistemological framework. It operates on the core, unshakable assumption that, scientifically speaking, there is absolutely nothing of value to be learned from primitive cultures unless it is knowledge that is already ours.
It's like walking into a room, seeing a child playing a beautiful, impossibly complex sonata on a grand piano, and instantly insisting that an adult must be hiding under the bench, physically moving the child's hands.
That is exactly what it is.
It totally dismisses the subject's own capacity for independent knowledge. It demands that you, listening right now, stop and really reflect. How often do we encounter a different culture, or even just a different political viewpoint, and automatically assume our baseline of knowledge is the only valid true one?
It is a very dangerous blind spot. And as Mudimbe brilliantly transitions in his work, this cultural categorization, this stubborn refusal to see the other as an independent subject of knowledge, wasn't just an accidental quirk of art history or astronomy. It actually became the foundational systemic bedrock for an entire, highly respected academic discipline designed specifically to study the other.
And that discipline is anthropology, the science of studying humans. If the physical colonizers controlled the land, the anthropologists were basically brought in to control the narrative of who these people actually were.
Yes.
And to understand how anthropology weaponized this categorization, Mudimbe leans heavily on Michel Foucault and his archaeology of the human sciences. Foucault argues that Western thought went through a massive seismic rupture at the end of the 18th century.
Yes, Foucault's book, The Order of Things, is absolutely vital here. Foucault maps out different epistemes, which are essentially the unconscious underlying rules that govern what an entire society considers to be true knowledge at any given time. He argues that during the European classical age, which is primarily the 17th and 18th centuries, the absolute center of knowledge was the principle of order.
I really need you to explain what that order looks like in practice, because order just sounds very abstract.
Think of a grand, sweeping 18th century botanical garden. The supreme goal of the classical scientist was to collect every single plant in the world, observe their visible physical characteristics, the shape of the leaf, the exact number of petals, and then place them into massive static grids and tables of classification.
Just putting things in boxes.
Exactly. They were obsessed with taxonomies, with general grammar, and naming things based strictly on their visible differences and identities. The entire world was viewed as a giant static table waiting to be filled in by the European observer.
Okay, so it's all about surface level categorization, putting everything into its proper God-given box. But then Foucault says this entire framework completely shatters at the end of the 18th century. Why? What replaces it?
There's a radical, almost violent mutation in thought. The episteme shifts away from the theme of order and static tables and moves to the dynamic theme of history and internal mechanisms.
What does that spark?
This is when we see the sudden birth of modern biology, modern economics, and philology, which is the historical study of language. Scientists literally stop just looking at the shape of the leaf, and they start desperately looking for the invisible internal functions. How does the plant actually process water? How did it evolve over thousands of years?
Ah, I get it. The focus moves from the visible surface to the invisible machinery running underneath.
Exactly. Foucault says that suddenly, transcendentals like labor, life, and language
Yeah.
completely take over. And the most profound, world-changing consequence of this shift is the invention of man as an object of study.
Meaning?
For the first time in human history, human beings become both the subject who is doing the knowing and the object being scientifically studied.
The observer turns the microscope on themselves and on humanity as a whole. And when this new episteme looks at non-European societies, Foucault says they initially use three specific models: function, conflict, and signification. Let's unpack the function model first, because that really seems to be where the early anthropologists did their most severe damage.
Oh, absolutely. When you study a foreign society purely through the lens of function, asking how their society functions compared to yours, you inevitably create a rigid dichotomy. You immediately establish your own Western society as the absolute baseline of normal functioning.
Right.
Therefore, any society that functions differently is immediately scientifically categorized as a pathology. It is viewed as abnormal, sick, or stunted.
So if a European society functions via a written legal code and a capitalist free market, and an African society functions via oral tradition and communal land ownership, the African society isn't seen as just delightfully different. It's seen as medically and socially pathological.
Precisely. This model gave early, highly influential anthropologists like Emile Durkheim and Lucien Levy-Bruhl the hard scientific justification to diagnose primitive mentalities as morbid, pre-logical, or stuck in a tragic state of arrested development.
Wow.
They were scientifically validating the colonial mission. They were saying, we need to go cure these sick societies.
But eventually the episteme shifts again, right? Foucault notes a move away from those pathologizing models and toward the models of norm, rule, and system.
This is a crucial, much-needed evolution. When anthropology finally shifts to analyzing a society from the point of view of its own internal rules and systems, everything changes. Because a system, by definition, has its own internal logic.
I see. If you are judging them by your rules, they're constantly failing. But if you look at their rules, they might actually be playing a perfect game.
Exactly. You can no longer easily dismiss a society as a pathology of Western civilization. You have to admit that their myths, their kinship structures, and their behaviors, which might seem utterly absurd or chaotic to a European observer at first glance, actually operate perfectly coherently within their own closed system.
Anthropology had to grow up.
It was forced to evolve. It had to stop judging primitives on a single, straight, diachronic line of evolutionary progress and start actually trying to understand the complex internal rules of their specific game.
And the scholar who really drove this home, who essentially dropped a bomb on the old way of anthropological thinking, was Claude Lévi-Strauss. He introduces this amazing concept of the savage mind.
Lévi-Strauss was genuinely revolutionary. He violently rejected the old, tired antinomy between the supposedly logical, scientific Western mind and the irrational, pre-logical primitive mind. He argued forcefully that the savage mind is, in fact, highly logical and ruthlessly systematic.
How so? Because the traditional Western view is that magic and science were just like chronological steps. You start with primitive people doing rain dances, which is magic, and eventually, if they're lucky, they evolve into advanced people building irrigation canals, which is science.
Right, but Lévi-Strauss completely dismantled that evolutionary ladder. He argued that magic and science are not sequential stages of development at all. They are parallel, equally valid modes of acquiring knowledge. They actually require the exact same sort of complex mental operations, detailed observation, forming a hypothesis, rigorous categorization.
They just apply those mental operations to entirely different phenomena.
Yes. He draws a brilliant contrast. He compares what he calls the science of the concrete to the science of the abstract. The science of the abstract is Western engineering, creating specific, abstract tools for specific, brand new tasks. The science of the concrete, which he strongly associates with the savage mind, he equates to bricolage.
Bricolage, like a tinkerer or a handyman.
Precisely. A bricoleur is someone who tackles a complex problem using only the diverse, heterogeneous materials and tools that are already at hand.
MacGyver, basically.
Basically, they repurpose ancient myths, deep observations of nature, and social signs to perfectly organize and explain the chaos of the universe.
Ugh.
Levi-Strauss argued that studying these mythological systems wasn't about proving Western superiority at all. It was about discovering universal structures of human thought that could actually teach the West a profound lesson in humility.
I absolutely love that concept of bricolage. It beautifully frames indigenous knowledge not as a sad lack of engineering, but as a hyper-resourceful, totally different type of science. However, while Levi-Strauss is out there preaching humility, not every anthropologist in the field actually got that memo.
No, sadly, they did not.
And Mudimbe makes sure to highlight this by bringing up a book that is just shockingly blunt, Nigel Barley's memoir, Adventures in a Mud Hut.
Barley's book is a fascinating inclusion by Mudimbe because it aggressively strips away all the noble scientific pretenses of the discipline. Barley was a British anthropologist, and he traveled to North Cameroon in the late 1970s to study the Dawayos. And he explicitly admits, in print, he chose them because they had skull cults and a reputation for being, in his exact words, recalcitrant and savage.
He literally went looking for the most extreme exoticism he could possibly find. And what does he conclude about the ultimate purpose of his long field work?
He states, permanently on the record, that the true justification for anthropological fieldwork is absolutely not about making a contribution to the native community. He compares the grueling fieldwork experience to a monastic life. He bluntly claims that academic research among these people is really all about, and I quote, the perfection of one's own soul.
I am still stunned by the sheer audacity of that admission. To walk into someone else's culture, to casually observe their most sacred private rites, to live among them while they desperately struggle with the realities of marginality we discussed earlier, and then to come back to Europe and declare, wow, that was a fantastic exercise for my personal spiritual growth.
It is incredibly narcissistic.
It treats their entire existence like an eat, pray, love retreat for the Western academic.
It perfectly exposes the deeply ethnocentric core that still plagued the discipline even then. It highlights that anthropology often serves as an exploration of the Western mind's own internal deserts, rather than a genuinely objective study of the other. The native culture is simply used as an exotic, living mirror for the anthropologist's self-reflection.
Let me try to synthesize all of this Foucault and anthropology stuff into an analogy, because here's where it gets really interesting. Foucault's epistemological shift is essentially a massive global software update. The West upgraded their operating system from classical Windows to modern OS.
Okay, I follow.
The old programs like judging societies strictly by how much they physically resembled biblical ancestors didn't run on the new OS anymore. They needed a totally new, sophisticated program, evolutionary anthropology, to process the massive amounts of complex data coming in from these newly encountered societies.
It tracks perfectly with Foucault's rupture.
But here's the catch. Even though the software was shiny and new and supposedly way more objective, the user sitting at the keyboard, the Western observer, still had the exact same fundamental goal. They were still using the new software to validate their own supremacy and perfect their own souls. The epistemological field changed, sure, but the ethnocentric will to power remained entirely intact.
That is exactly Mudimbe's core critique. The anthropologist still invents the culture they believe they are objectively studying, organizing all that data to fit the new scientific paradigms of their era while desperately maintaining the old hierarchy.
And while the anthropologists were out there taking careful notes to perfect their souls and test their shiny new scientific systems, another group was using the exact same epistemological grid, but with much, much higher stakes. They weren't just categorizing, they were actively trying to save souls and literally conquer territory. We have to look at the missionaries.
The missionary discourse is arguably the most powerful, enduring, and complex pillar in the entire invention of Africa, because the missionary doesn't just arrive with the temporal authority of the state or the intellectual authority of science. They arrive wielding the ultimate unquestionable authority, divine truth.
But they didn't just show up unannounced one day. The theological and legal justification for their presence was laid down centuries before the actual scramble for Africa even began. Mudimbe points us way back to the 15th century papal bulls.
Yes, specifically the Bulls Dum Diverses in 1452 and Romanus Pontifex in 1455.
Wait, 1452, that is decades before Columbus even sailed. What did these ancient documents actually decree?
They are chilling historical documents. Issued by Pope Nicholas V, they explicitly gave the kings of Portugal, and by extension, all Christian monarchs, the divine right and apostolic authority to invade, conquer, expel, and fight Muslims, pagans, and other enemies of Christ wherever they might be found.
It's essentially a blank check from God for global conquest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Pope explicitly granted them the sweeping power to occupy all kingdoms, principalities, and possessions held by non-Christians, to dispossess them of all their property, and most horrifyingly, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery.
That is horrific.
And this established the foundational legal and theological concept of terra nullius nobis land.
Meaning, if a Christian doesn't own it, it legally belongs to no one.
Precisely. The premise was that non-Christian natives simply had no right to an autonomous political existence or legal land ownership.
So, when the missionary arrives in an African village centuries later, they aren't just a humble preacher bringing a Bible. They are the vanguard of a massive, legally sanctioned spiritual and physical expropriation. They are basically the soft power front of terra nullius.
They were absolutely the most consistent agents of radical transformation. The ultimate aim was the total destruction of pre-colonial societies and their rapid replacement by new Christian societies fashioned precisely in the image of Europe. And Mudimbe outlines 3 historical models of the missionary to demonstrate how this discourse evolved, yet ruthlessly maintained its core objective across centuries.
Let's walk through these 3 models because they really show the evolution of the software. Let's start with the 17th century.
The first model is represented by Giovanni Francesco Romano, who was an Italian missionary who traveled to the Congo in the mid-1600s. Romano is a totally perfect example of the epistemology of similitude we discussed earlier with the painting. He saw the African world strictly, 100%, through the lens of Catholic orthodoxy. He didn't see an alien, incomprehensible culture. He just saw a slightly defective African version of a European kingdom.
So he just aggressively mapped European structures onto the Congo.
Literally. He referred to Congolese leaders strictly as dukes, earls, and counts. His belief in a universal human origin was so absolute and unyielding that he literally wrote in his official reports that Congolese babies are actually born white, and they only gradually turn black over time.
That is astonishing. He literally couldn't compute difference, so his brain hallucinated sameness.
Exactly. For Romano, the mission wasn't about understanding the local culture at all. It was simply about extending the true universal faith to the poor and pagan and integrating them into the only worldview that actually existed for him.
Okay, that's the 17th century, just brute force, blind assimilation. But the second model from the 19th century is way more complex, and honestly, it's heartbreaking. Samuel Ajayi Crowther.
Crowther is a profoundly fascinating and tragic figure in history. He was a native of Yorubaland in present-day Nigeria. He was captured as a slave, eventually freed by a British naval patrol, educated in England, and eventually he became the first African Anglican bishop in 1864.
Now, you would naturally assume that an African bishop would view his own people with significantly more nuance and respect than a European missionary would.
You would certainly assume that, but Crowther had totally internalized the Western evolutionary grid. When he wrote about his own unwesternized brethren, he didn't use local understanding or empathy. He used the exact same harsh classificatory markers of the savage syndrome that white European explorers used.
Really?
Yes, he constantly emphasized their paganism, their nakedness, and lurid rumors of cannibalism. He viewed his own ancestral culture as a state of total darkness, requiring absolute cultural and spiritual regeneration through British Christianity.
I have to stop here, because I am really struggling to understand the psychology of this. Why would he do that? Is Crowther experiencing a sort of intellectual Stockholm syndrome? How does a native African become the very instrument of the colonizing structure's gaze against his own people?
It is a devastating realization about the sheer power of epistemological control. Education in this specific context acted as a Trojan horse.
Right.
If the only language you are formally taught to speak, the only scientific categories you are taught to use, and the only theology you are taught to revere completely belong to the colonizer, you will inevitably use those exact tools to dissect and condemn your own people. Crowther represents the ultimate, horrifying success of the colonizing structure, the colonized mind actively policing and subjugating itself.
You couldn't see them through African eyes because his eyes had literally been replaced.
It is so sad. That brings us to the third model from the 20th century, The Belgian missionary Placide Tempels, the author of Bantu philosophy. Tempels is famous and very often heavily praised for this 1945 book. He lived among the Luba-Katanga people in the Belgian Congo for a solid decade. And to his great credit, he revolutionized missionary thought by actively rejecting the old, tired anthropological idea that Africans were just empty vessels or pre-logical primitives.
Right, he actually sat down and listened to them.
He did. He argued that the Bantu possessed a profound, highly organized, and deeply logical ontology, a philosophy centered around the dynamic concept of vital force. He told his fellow Europeans that if they wanted to effectively civilize the Bantu, they had to stop treating them like ignorant children and start deeply understanding and respecting this underlying philosophical system.
On the surface, that sounds like a massive step forward. I mean, a European finally admitting an African culture has a complex philosophy. Where is the catch?
The catch is entirely in the ultimate aim. It was a huge step forward in method, but absolutely not in destination. Tempels, despite his deep, genuine respect for Bantu philosophy, still ultimately concluded that Western Christianity was the absolute only possible consummation of the Bantu ideal.
Oh, I see.
He believed that the Bantu vital force was fundamentally lacking on its own and could only ever reach its true, intended perfection through Christian civilization.
Wow, so the ethnocentric core is still completely intact. Western Christianity is still sitting pretty at the apex of human spiritual evolution. African philosophy is just validated as a really useful stepping stone to help them get there. They basically just built a nicer road, but it still leads to the exact same cultural erasure.
Precisely. And Mudimbe breaks down the actual psychological mechanics of how this missionary discourse operated on the ground, day to day. He cites an African philosopher named Fabien Ebusi Bulaga, who brilliantly identifies three stages, or what he violently calls three moments of violence, in the missionary's approach.
Let's look at the mechanism of the spiritual violence. What is the first moment?
The first moment is derision. The missionary arrives and fundamentally ridicules the pagan gods, the ancestral spirits, and all the local beliefs. They aggressively strip them of any divine validity, constantly denouncing their mythological and absurd character. Christianity immediately claims an absolute monopoly on the true image of God.
Step 1. Mock and totally invalidate the existing reality. What is step 2?
The second moment is refutation and demonstration. The missionary systematically reduces the complex pagan religions to simply being the black side of a white transcendental Christianity. Local deities are literally mapped onto Satan or local demons.
That's convenient.
Then the missionary demonstrates the absolute superiority of the Christian faith, not just through theology, but by pointing to the material world.
How so? Like, look at our stuff.
Exactly. They point to the historical coherence, the massive economic progress, the advanced medicine, and the terrifying technological power of Western civilization. They say, look at our massive ships, our guns, our immense wealth, and our hospitals. Clearly, our God is the real one because he rewards us. They effectively give a divine seal of approval to a specific cultural and economic model.
They literally use the spoils of capitalism to prove the validity of their theology. That is brutally effective. And what's the final step?
The final moment of violence is orthodoxy and conformity. This is the absolute imposition of their faith. The convert cannot just casually add Jesus to their existing pantheon of local spirits. That's not allowed. They must completely renounce their former will, their beloved ancestors, and their ancient traditions. They must adopt the strict rules, the rigid ethics, and the historical worldview of the colonizer. It is a demand for total, unconditional spiritual and cultural capitulation.
You know what the craziest part of all of this historical analysis is? The strategy totally worked. Or at least the demographic data strongly suggests this a massive historic shift. The text shares Vatican statistics that are just staggering to think about today.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is one of the most significant and incredibly rapid demographic shifts in modern religious history. After a century of this intense, highly structural evangelization, the Christian community in sub-Saharan Africa has grown exponentially. And the paradox here is profound.
Yeah.
While European Catholicism, which is the absolute source of this missionary zeal, is aging, declining rapidly, and facing wildly plummeting numbers of priests and seminarians, Africa is experiencing an unprecedented religious boom.
The numbers in the text are just wild.
Seminaries in Africa are literally overflowing. Monasteries are completely full. New, vibrant, charismatic movements are thriving everywhere. The percentage of the world's major Catholic seminarians coming from Africa has skyrocketed. By the year 2000, and certainly as we look at the projections deep into the 21st century, Africa is poised to have the absolute largest concentration of Christians in the entire world.
It is the ultimate historical irony. The religion that was explicitly brought over on gunboats as a tool of European domestication and psychological control is currently dying out in Europe, but it is totally exploding in the very lands it was meant to pacify.
Which forces us to ask a highly critical question. How Western is this converted Africa? Is this massive Christian population truly submitting to Western orthodoxy, or is it something else entirely now?
That's a great point.
Many sociologists note that Africans are heavily drawn to the deep sense of community, the promise of salvation amid the brutal chaos of marginality, and the desire to belong to a powerful global network. But beneath the calm surface of this conformity, there was a profound intellectual tension brewing for decades.
And that tension finally reached a boiling point. The African intellectuals of the mid to late 20th century, the generation that actually grew up in the immediate aftermath of colonialism, looked at this entire massive apparatus. They saw the violent physical conquest, the demeaning anthropological categorization, the missionary spiritual violence, and they completely rebelled.
Yes.
They realized that Western religion and Western science were essentially just Trojan horses for ongoing cultural domination. Let's move into the final, and I honestly think the most triumphant section of our deep dive: African gnosis and the amplification of the subject.
The 1960s and 70s saw the spectacular rise of a brilliant, highly educated generation of African thinkers. We were talking major philosophers, theologians, and sociologists like Fabian Ebusbulaga, Paul Ntunji, Alexis Kagame, and Engelbert Mveng.
And these guys weren't outsiders throwing rocks. Many of them were educated in the absolute most prestigious European universities. Some of them were even ordained Catholic priests.
Exactly. They understood the Western epistemological grid intimately because they had been rigorously trained inside it. They knew Foucault back to front. They knew Hegel. They knew Aristotle perfectly. And their focus shifted dramatically from the generation that came before them.
How so?
The previous generation of leaders was primarily focused on political sovereignty. Gaining physical independence from colonial rule, raising their own new flags. But this new generation of intellectuals realized that political freedom was essentially hollow without scientific and intellectual sovereignty. You can govern your own country, but if the world still understands your people strictly through the heavily biased lens of Western anthropology, you are still colonized. They knew they had to forcibly take control of the paradigms of truth.
And to do that, they had to actively destroy the very myth of Africa that Mudimbe is writing about. There is this truly fascinating argument by Paulin Hountondie where he says they need to deliberately impoverish the concept of Africa. Why on earth would you want to make the concept of your own continent poorer?
It sounds totally counterintuitive, but it is a brilliant strategic move. Hountondie clearly recognized that Africanity, this mystical glowing halo of values, the vague idea of a unified, deeply spiritual African soul, was largely a complete invention.
Right.
It was a romanticized grid placed over a vast, immensely diverse continent by Western anthropologists and even by early African independence movements like Negritude. It was fundamentally designed to make a massive, complicated continent easily digestible for European consumption.
Oh, like you all just share this one mystical vibe so we don't have to learn your individual histories.
Right. Hountondie argued that this overloaded concept was literally suffocating them. To truly understand their own complex regional histories, African intellectuals had to deliberately weaken or impoverish this bloated, massive concept. They had to aggressively strip away all the ethical, religious, and philosophical baggage that the anthropological tradition had just dumped onto it.
Just clear the board.
They needed to reduce Africa back to a neutral geographical reality. Only then could they start fresh, dealing with the actual, diverse, complex histories without constantly carrying the crushing burden of the Western gaze.
It's like realizing your brand new computer is completely bogged down by a massive, clunky operating system installed by the manufacturer. Before you can write your own efficient code, you have to completely wipe the hard drive clean. And the philosopher Ebusbulaga provides the new source code with his concept of the récit pour soi.
The récit pour soi translates beautifully to a narrative for oneself. Ebusbulaga powerfully argued that for centuries the African subject had been actively written out of their own history. They were relentlessly forced to imitate a truth and a history that was realized completely outside of themselves over in Europe. The récit pour soi is the active, highly critical reconstruction of history purely from the African perspective.
It's finally taking the pen back.
It is the brutal process of reclaiming the African we subject from the total madness and the arbitrariness of colonial history. It is a conscious, deliberate negation of the colonial narrative, perfectly designed to carve out a sovereign intellectual space where the African is finally the active subject making their own history, rather than just the passive object being studied by someone else's science.
And this intellectual rebellion wasn't just happening in secular universities, right? It bled right into the heart of the church itself. You had these incredibly powerful African theologians like Cardinal Malula in Zaire and Cardinal Zongrana in Upper Volta aggressively pushing for a radical new theology. They demanded a theology of incarnation. How is this actually different from what the European missionaries wanted?
It is a radical foundational departure. In the 1950s, the Vatican tried a very mild policy of adaptation. They realized they were losing touch, so they gently allowed hymns to be translated into local languages or permitted African drums to be played in the liturgy. But the core theology, the strict Roman legalism, remained entirely Western. It was just a superficial paint job.
Literally just putting a new skin on the old software.
Exactly. The theology of incarnation, heavily promoted by these new African thinkers, demanded something far, far more profound. They argued that African traditional religions, deeply complex African history, and even the horrific, agonizing trauma of the slave trade and colonization were absolutely not signs of spiritual darkness.
Okay.
Rather, they were deeply valid divine preparations for a uniquely African Christianity. They sought to literally incarnate the gospel into the living African reality, completely divorcing it from Western cultural history. They claimed God was actively speaking to them in their own historical language long before the Europeans ever arrived on their shores.
That is a theological earthquake.
Yeah.
But to prove their intellectual validity to the rigid academic world, they did something I found just brilliantly subversive. I really want to dive deep into Alexis Kagame and his work Bantu Rwandan Philosophy of Being.
Kagame's work is an absolute masterpiece of intellectual strategy. Kagame was a brilliant Rwandan philosopher and priest, and he wanted to definitively destroy the anthropological myth of the pre-logical primitive mind once and for all. But he knew, realistically, that if he just used African oral traditions as proof, the Western academies would immediately dismiss him. So what did he do?
What's the trick?
He took strict classical Aristotelian models, the very foundational bedrock of Western logic, and applied them directly and perfectly to the Rwandan Bantu language.
I really need to understand the exact mechanism here, because how do you successfully map Aristotle onto a Bantu language?
Well, Aristotle categorized all of reality into highly specific categories of being, substance, quantity, quality, relation, etc. Kagame looked at the linguistic structure of his own native language, Kinyarwanda. He showed that the root word unto, which fundamentally means being, is modified by various prefixes into 4 distinct, perfectly logical philosophical categories.
Okay, what are they?
Muntu means the human being, the intelligent force. Kintu means the thing, the non-intelligent force. Hantu clearly designates place and time, and Kuntu definitively designates the mode or quality of being.
Wow. So he basically showed that their everyday language had a deeply metaphysical categorization system built right into the basic grammar.
Exactly. He demonstrated that these 4 categories encompass absolutely all of reality, perfectly mirroring and in some ways actually surpassing the elegance of Aristotelian logic.
That is genius.
He didn't do this just to mimic Europe. He did it to definitively prove to the West, using their own unimpeachable gold standard criteria, that the Bantu possessed a highly organized, deeply systematic, and profoundly complex philosophy of being. He literally beat the West at its own philosophical game.
I have an analogy for what Kagame and these thinkers are doing, and I love it. They are essentially brilliant hackers reverse engineering the oppressor source code.
Oh, absolutely.
They are meticulously taking the programming languages of the West Husserl's phenomenology, Aristotle's logic, Foucault's archaeology, and using them to systematically hack into and completely dismantle the colonial mainframe. And while they are tearing down the firewall of Western superiority, they are simultaneously using that exact same code to build an incredibly secure, encrypted new architecture for their own indigenous identity.
That is a very apt analogy. It captures the subversion perfectly.
But let me gently push back on this because it feels like a really tough paradox. Does heavily relying on Western source code like Aristotelian logic or French structuralism ultimately compromise the authenticity of this new African gnosis? I mean, can you build a truly authentic sovereign African system if you are continually still using European programming languages to write it? Aren't they still somehow trapped?
That is the ultimate agonizing paradox that Mudimbi genuinely grapples with at the very end of the text. Mudimbe quotes Foucault, who famously asked, "Can one still philosophize where Hegel is no longer possible?"
That's a heavy question.
Mudimbe clearly recognizes that these African intellectuals are, inevitably, still caught within the incredibly sticky epistemological web of the West. They're using the language of the same to try and articulate the rights and the reality of the other.
So there really is no pure escape.
It is not about a pure, clean escape. Mudimbe strongly suggests that using these specific tools might actually be the only viable way out of the agonizing marginality we discussed. True liberation involves an exact, incredibly painful appreciation of the massive price you have to pay to detach yourself. You simply have to know the oppressor's logic intimately to successfully deconstruct it.
You have to know the machine to break it.
Yes. The same and the other have become deeply, permanently intertwined through the sheer violence of history. The goal of African gnosis absolutely isn't a naive, romantic return to a pure, untouched pre-colonial past, because frankly, that past is gone forever.
Right.
The true goal is the incredibly difficult forging of a brand new, fiercely sovereign intellectual space out of the very wreckage of colonialism itself.
That is a stunning, incredibly heavy conclusion to this journey. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. I mean, we started with the violently physical and economic organization of colonialism, literally slicing up a continent and forcing it into an agonizing marginal space. We explored how artists and early scientists visually and intellectually classified the savage to comfortably validate their own epistemology of similitude.
Okay.
We deeply dissected the spiritual imperialism of the missionaries who used divine truth to totally erase local cultures. And finally, we witnessed the brilliant intellectual reclamation by modern African thinkers who are actively reverse engineering the very systems used to oppress them to build a powerful new gnosis.
It's an incredible arc.
It really is, and it brings us right back to the question I asked you at the very beginning of this. If the entire concept of Africa as a monolithic, primitive idea was just an invention, a rigid, hallucinated grid placed over a vast, breathing, incredibly complex reality by outside observers trying to violently validate their own operating system, what parts of your identity are actually just inventions? Are the labels you use to define your own intelligence, the way you actually practice your faith, the political binaries you align with, or your perceived place in society truly your own? Or were they just subtly engineered by the massive institutions, the historical narratives, and the modern algorithms that constantly observe, classify, and categorize you? Think about that the next time you try to define who you are. Thank you to our expert for expertly guiding us through this dense terrain, and thank you for diving deep with us. Keep questioning the blueprints of your reality.